Keith RN, which is a resource for nurse educators that is really committed to empowering educators to be part of the needed change and transformation to develop the clinical judgment so students are empowered to think like a nurse. And if you go to my website, keithrn.com, I've got numerous resources that can serve your needs. I've got hundreds of blogs that I've written over the last several years on almost every topic for nurse educators. So please check them out if you haven't. I've also got numerous case studies to help students practice the decision-making of clinical judgment, and also have a free COVID-19 case study I'd like to share with you. And you can put this to use in your classroom or virtual clinical. And so thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule tonight. And I just love to know who's out there tonight. So, if you're coming out to this for the first time, I would just like to know who you are, where you're from, and just kind of let me know you're out there this evening. As we look at tonight's topic, today we'll be talking about incivility with Dr. Cynthia Clark, but the goal of this live stream is really to serve your needs, support your needs in nursing education, again, with practical strategies to help your students not only think like a nurse, but to also act like a nurse. And this is recorded, so this conversation, if you find it helpful, it lives on both YouTube, my YouTube channel, Think Like a Nurse, and there's a link that will be there immediately after this conversation, as well as on my Facebook page, Keith RN, Think Like a Nurse. And so if you already received my updates, you'll receive a link in tomorrow's email that I send out. And so go ahead and share this link. I know that this is just the beginning of educators who come and join me tonight. And I want you to share the love. If you find value in tonight's conversation, I want you to do so. One other resource I want you to be aware of that's a really easy entry point for every educator who's listening is that I'm the admin for a Facebook group titled Teachers Transforming Nursing Education. And some of you may say, I don't do Facebook. Well, you should do this Facebook group because it is a community of 7,000 plus nurse educators from around the world that are supporting each other. You can ask any question, you can share any resource, and they share lots of resources and handouts on this Facebook page. And so the bottom line is it's a powerful community of supportive educators committed to being part of the needed change. Now, if you were with us a month ago, we had Dr. Nelda Godfrey, who talked about the importance of professional identity formation in nursing education. The importance to not only teach our students to think like a nurse, but to feel and to act like a nurse. And I want you to know that you're in for a real treat tonight because we have one of a premier nurse educator who's not only one of my heroes, but she has been one of the most influential educators. When I look at my journey as a new nurse educator, there are 3 educators that have really formed my identity as an educator. Dr. Patricia Benner, Dr. Christine Tanner, and third, Dr. Cynthia Clark. And so as we know, she is one of the foremost experts on incivility and nursing education, but really talks about the positive aspects of creating civility, which is a culture of respect. And when I look at my journey as a new nurse educator several years ago, almost 10 years ago, I was an innovative educator back in the trenches and doing the best I could, recognizing as a practicing nurse, there was this disconnect. I brought change. I encouraged other of my faculty to change. But at the end of the semester, at the end of the year, I wasn't invited as a temporary hire to return. And when I found out what happened, why I didn't get that position, I'm not going to go into details, but Dr. Clark's work and those of other educators on this topic gave it a name: withholding information to set me up to fail. And in essence, one of the hallmark behaviors of incivility and bullying in nursing education. And it almost took me out of my game. At that point, I said, never again will I let myself be hurt and say, if I'm not valued, I'm done. And I almost threw away my birthright or my strength and talent as an educator and let the villain win. But by the grace of God, Cynthia Clark's work, came across. She inspired me, and she has a powerful book that belongs in every nurse educator's bookshelf. And we'll share the link here in this chat. It's called Creating and Sustaining Civility in Nursing Education. So besides Dr. Benner's book, Educating Nurses, A Call for Radical Transformation, every educator needs both of these resources to be empowered to be a part of the needed change. So that's enough of me. I want to introduce Dr. Cynthia Clark. And Dr. Cynthia Clark is award-winning professor, scholar, clinician, and author. She's a professor emeritus at Boise State University and the founder of Civility Matters. She serves as a fellow in the American Academy of Nursing, the NLN Academy of Nursing Education, and co-chaired the American Nurses Association professional panel on incivility, bullying, and workplace violence. Her pioneering work on fostering civility has brought national and international attention to the controversial issues of incivility in academic and practice environments. Dr. Clark's publications have appeared in a broad range of peer-reviewed and open access venues, and her empirical instruments have been translated into 16 languages and used by scholars in more than 30 countries. Her book, Creating and Sustaining Civility in Nursing Education, received first place honors in 2013 American Journal of Nursing Book of the Year. And finally, but not least, and probably most important, she and her husband are the parents of 3 successful young adults and the blissful owners of a motley crew of rescue pets. So please welcome one of my heroes, Dr. Cynthia Clark. And Cindy Clark, thank you so much for joining me tonight. This is like, I'm going to pop you in here. We'll get both of us here. It's such a pleasure to have you with us tonight. And, you had a busy work day today. You had an all-day workshop. And here you are. We're going to you're coming from the mountains in Boise, Idaho. Are you still in the Idaho range?
Absolutely. Yes. Hello, everyone.
Welcome. Yeah. And, I just, like to start out, Cindy, with all of, any guest on this panel and just kind of find out, what interested, when you go back to your journey, all of us in nursing education, we didn't dream that we would wind up where we are 30, 40 years later. And we look back and we say, what kind of, what started this journey for you wanting to be a nurse? And then that translation to nursing education. So I just love to kind of hear your story and just kind of what got that journey started. What was your passion as it related to nursing and nursing education?
Oh, gosh. Thanks for the question. But first, I just got to say hello.
Yeah,
not only to you and to all the crew that's joining us. I actually know a few of the people, and it's like, yay! It's like this just friendship that we've all developed over the years. So it's just lovely to see everybody. I just want to thank you, Dr. Richard, Keith. Oh my gosh, I've been really looking forward to this tonight, and I want to thank you for that kind introduction. But I also want to thank you for the amazing work that you're doing on clinical judgment and all the contributions that you've made to nursing and nursing education. So high five.
Thank you.
You're really terrific. So, gosh, so back to your question, like, what happened? How did I get here some 40 years later or whatever it's been? So I just want to start a little bit with my clinical background, because I think a lot of us started as clinicians, which, by the way, talk about incivility. What? You're not a dyed-in-the-wool educator? You came from the clinical setting? Really? What might you have to offer? But so I started as I am a behavioral health nurse, and my specialty is working with adolescents, mostly with mental health issues, substance abuse issues, but I specialized in violence prevention. So a lot of the kids that I worked with, I had the great joy of being on a hotshot crew, a member of a hotshot mental health crew. I mean, they were amazing. I still think about that time and call it my golden moment of my career. But we worked with some pretty tough kids. Many of them had a history of violence, substance abuse. A lot of them had committed a lot of serious crimes. They were facing incarceration or were incarcerated. And they'd been told a lot, messages like this: and maybe some of you can relate to this, but you're a waste of space. I wish you had never been born. I should have aborted you. Or what's one more dead gangster? So over and over, these powerful and dangerous and damaging messages that we give to our young people, or at least the young people I was working with. And we decided as a crew of mental health people, we're going to focus on strength. We're going to focus on what's right. We're going to name the problem, but we're going to focus on what's right with these kids, what gives them strength, what makes them special, what makes them unique. And so that's what I did for a very long time. And I have to tell you, so I was literally sitting in my office where at the time I was working in a long-term residential center, and a nursing professor from the university came and said, "Hey, I think you should apply for this nursing faculty position." And I said, "What? No, I don't know. That wouldn't work for me." But over time, she sort of niggled me enough that I said, "Okay, I'll go apply." And it was really interesting because I was sitting in the interview and they were asking me, "Well, what are you going to do if you have a student maybe who's angry or something?" And I'm thinking literally in my head, Keith, I'm thinking, you know what? I deal with people with guns in their hands, so I can probably
you can handle that. You can handle an uncivil student.
Probably manage that angry adolescent, but anyway, or that angry student. But that's how it all began. So then I started my career and worked 20 years as a nursing faculty. So wow. It was awesome. It was good. Not always good, but on reflection, a wonderful time.
Well, tell me, when did you start writing? When did you start becoming really focusing in? You've written, I don't know how many, Dr. Clark, but you have written how many articles that have been published in nursing education journals for how many years, and about how many articles have been published of your work?
Well,
and you focused on one topic, and that's incivility.
Well, yeah, my very, very early works that aren't a lot known to people really stemmed from my working with adolescent gangs and adolescent violence.
Okay.
And I remember, so I was publishing early on, way back. I think my first publication was in '89, where it looked at, again, how do we create with these young people a sense of desire to accomplish and to live a successful life. How do we do that? Mm-hmm. So really, my work began way back then when I started publishing. And I remember one of my mentors saying to me, "This is awesome because clinicians don't write. They're too busy." And I said, I've got to write. So I've always written. And I was mentored early on around my program of research to build it almost like a chess game. What is your next move? What will the next paper look like? And, I've never really counted my papers, but I can say that I know it's over 100 because here's why. And there's what I encourage a lot of folks out there to do if they're not already doing it. That, yeah, it's cool to publish the gold standard in peer-reviewed journals. That's wonderful. But I really my philosophy of scholarship is one of generosity. So the generous scholar publishes in more than just the gold standard. I love to write essays and blogs, and for over 10 years, I blogged for Sigma.
Wonderful.
So I would say that I probably have over 100 publications, including my books.
Okay. But you have honed in, Cindy, on the topic of incivility in nursing education. That's what your book is titled. That's what the essence of a lot of your work focuses in on. And I'd just like to know, is there a story to that? What's kind of the essence of what led you to address a lot of the body of your work? Not all of it, of course, but I think a majority of it on that topic, which is what I think you're most widely known for.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that's true, in some form or fashion. I keep coming back to this question, and maybe because I'm a behavioral health nurse, but I've always, even as a child, really, been intrigued by human behavior. Why do people do what they do? What is that motivation for whatever behaviors they might be displaying? And I was raised by wise women, my mother and my grandmother, who, by the way, were not formally educated at all, who instilled in me a passion for people and that it matters how we treat one another. It matters, whether or not we show up in ways that elevate people. And so, though my wise women weren't educated in the formal sense, that got into my gut and my DNA. And I'm like, I just can't help myself. This is what I do. This is what I was born to do. It sounds probably really hokey to you,
No.
but I think this is my path, and I have pursued it now for many decades.
Yeah.
Maybe since childhood, who knows?
But when you say that, Cindy, what I'm thinking of is like someone like, I think what you're speaking though is to the heart of what it means to not only be a caring person, but to really embody the essence of what it means to be a nurse. I think of Mother Teresa, who saw the value and the inherent respect and dignity that every person that she cared for, of the poorest of the poor, of the undignified castes in India, she saw the value and the dignity and the worth in every human being. And it sounds like, in essence, you're really communicating and really sharing that same spirit. And that we as educators really need to, see our students and our colleagues through that same lens. Is that not correct?
I couldn't agree with you more. And, when I think about probably everybody tuning in or who will tune in, that's what drives us in nursing, is that compassion for other people. And somewhere along the line, some people lose that, or maybe they never had it in the beginning. And it's not to say that they can't regain it, because I'm also a person of hope and
People can change.
optimism.
People can change.
People can change, because think about it. I mean, I even think, you know, probably everyone can relate to this. So imagine after you were launched out of your family of origin, all right? So maybe you're 19 or 20 or whatever you are, and you come back and you visit your parents and you go, why do I feel like I'm 13 again? Because we're held sometimes to this previous standard of how we used to behave. And it's like, wait, Dad, I've changed. I don't steal your car anymore. So I just think that we need to recapture that in nursing.
Yeah. And this is a really good time, Cindy, to kind of then, when you talk about the behaviors, let's define first kind of these behaviors that are really hurtful to our students, to each other, and even as we look at the profession itself and how we sometimes in the practice setting are treating each other. And so we've got to name it. We've got to define some of these key terms. So when we talk, we hear the word incivility, we hear the words bullying, maybe even the word mobbing. Let's define that briefly, Cindy, from your body of work, and as you look at it as a researcher who has defined this and has done the research. Let's define, really, to begin with, incivility and bullying. How are they similar? How are they different? But what are they? So we know that as an educator, it's kind of like sometimes we experience things by our colleagues, and it's like, what's wrong with me? Is it my fault? What is it? And you start to blame yourself when really it's outside of you, and it's basically incivility, or it may not be. So let's kind of define these terms and how you see it.
Yeah, I think that's uber important, because there's a lot of different ways that people talk about these concepts, and sometimes they kind of run together. So I appreciate the ability or the opportunity to kind of deconstruct them just a little bit. So I'd like to start first with incivility. And most scholars who write on this topic would agree that when you're talking about incivility, that it's a range of lower intensity acts of aggression, if you will. And I tend to think of these, I should have prefaced this to say that I tend to think about them in as various forms of workplace aggressions. And so when we think about incivility, so that lower range, if you will, or that lower intensity act of aggression. But here's the thing, anyone who's experienced that knows that if it's happened to you, or you've observed it, because we also know that observing these kinds of things happening to our colleagues can have real damaging effects. If we don't address these, quote, lower intensity acts, they can escalate. And so when we think about incivility, sometimes what comes to mind are some of the nonverbals, like we roll our eyes, or we finger point, or we slam our door, or we do all kinds of things. We haven't said a word yet. We have conveyed to that individual, our disdain, if you will. And then there's more overt acts of incivility, like spreading rumors and gossip and name calling, or putting us down. And sometimes, oh, I was only kidding, when they put us down because of our religion, or our weight, or our race, or our ethnicity, or our age, or any number of reasons. Or they post things on social media sites that are so damaging, and sometimes we don't even know about them until they come back to haunt us. And you mentioned something in the beginning, because I often say incivility is not only what we do, it's what we don't do. So you gave the example of withholding information, and we think, oh, I'm going to hang on to that, and they won't know about it, and boy, howdy, I hold the upper hand. Or we marginalize people, or we fail to acknowledge them. I mean, I remember students saying to me, Dr. Clark, how can it be that I'm walking down the hall and I'm passing my faculty and they don't say a word? They don't even say good morning. They don't acknowledge me. And so there's any number of ways that we can ignore and, marginalize people simply by our silence and our nonverbal. Now, when we get to bullying, and sometimes these seem to be similar, and they are, but when we think about bullying, typically we're thinking about a persistent pattern of abusive behavior, almost always characterized by somebody asserting real or perceived power. So it's this sort of power over dynamic. And I see this a lot in my work, particularly it seems to play out, well, in many domains, but especially around promotion and tenure. And a novice faculty or junior faculty, reluctant to speak up, because if they do, they put really their livelihood in jeopardy, at least in their opinion, by speaking up, and what will happen to their promotion and tenure and other areas for advancement. And then you mentioned mobbing.
Yeah.
Now, that one is getting a lot of attention these days, and I call it bullying on steroids. And here's why. This is a very soul-crushing experience. This is where an individual or a group of individuals coalesce or collude with others to form this group. So it's sort of a social piling on. So it's not just me bullying you. It's me with my crew bullying you and targeting you with the intent to ridicule, to marginalize, to humiliate. And if people have been on the receiving end of that, I can tell you this, that the physical, the emotional, the psychological, the spiritual, and sometimes the financial damage that does is unbelievable. And some people never really fully recovered from it. And we're losing good people. We are losing, I've talked to a couple deans recently where we're losing some of our top performers because of these toxic work conditions. And we can't afford to do that. We need, faculty to be involved and to help to create a healthy work environment.
And so let's kind of just briefly then kind of, Cindy, in the context of nursing education, because we got practice behaviors eventually that are very similar, but most of the people listening are nurse educators and maybe a handful of students. And so when we look at academia, when you look at like student to faculty, which gets the most attention, but what doesn't get as much attention is faculty to student.
Yeah.
Incivility. And then we've got faculty to faculty incivility. So briefly, on those three dynamics that are all present and may all be present, or maybe, I mean, it's kind of like depending on the culture, but what does it look like now if you to bring it down to, so that students, we can kind of identify and help our students recognize what is uncivil behavior from students, what about from faculty to students, and then to each other?
Yeah, well, there's any number of ways that human beings can treat each other not so well. But I'll just give a few examples of student to faculty, and I'm going to go back to the mobbing because that one, as an example. There are lots of examples. I'm going to pluck that one out because sometimes students will be involved in mobbing and we don't know about it because they're doing it on some of their social media sites away from faculty. And we can see it a little bit on things like Rate Your Professor, where there's just an annihilation against the professor. But there's a number of ways that can happen. Faculty to student. I just met with a couple hundred students from various schools last week. And I asked them, what is your lived experience right now? So it was just a conversation. It wasn't a research, experience, just a conversation. Talk to me about what your lived experience is during all this COVID pandemic and its manifestations. And the prevailing theme from a lot of the students, certainly not all, but many of them saying that our faculty treat us as though they expect us to fail. And say things to us like, why did you ever decide to be a nurse? You're not going to make it through this program. How did you even get this far? So comments like that. And so when I asked the students, what would be a remedy for that? What would you wish to happen? And they said, we just want some words of encouragement. We know that we're in a learner role. We're not going to nail this the first time. Please be patient with us and, prop us up a little bit. Mm-hmm. Faculty to faculty is really interesting because I just completed a national study. My research team and I just completed and published a national study. We asked lots and lots of questions, but essentially we were assessing the state of civility and incivility in nursing education between and among faculty, and the findings were really incredible. In some ways, we might be moving the needle a little bit from the previous national study I did a few years ago, but in many ways we're not. So some things that faculty do to one another is what you described, that sort of set up to fail. Not providing the kind of information that they need to do their jobs, belittling them in faculty meetings. And the worst part of it is nobody's speaking up. One of the findings in that study that was really interesting to me was one of the questions that we asked was, first of all, do you avoid addressing incivility? Do you avoid it? If you do avoid it, why? Well, guess what? Of those 1,200 or so people, 85% said, I don't even deal with it. Mm-hmm. And those who, they said, and here's why we avoid it. Fear of retaliation, personal and professional. It only makes matters worse. I don't have the skill sets to do it. I'm worried that if I address it, particularly if it's a student situation, that it's going to tank my evaluations, which therefore impacts my livelihood. So It's messy, it's complicated, and then you only asked about nursing education. Then you have to factor in all the stuff that's going on in the clinical setting with folks there. So I could go on and on and on.
I know. Martha Griffin talked about in her work on cognitive rehearsal. If I remember, I think it was Griffin, but she had one of the professional, she called it a professional behavior was standing up for the absent colleague. That's how a professional behaves. And I think it's important, Cindy, that when you look at when you were talking about that, I thought of the Good Samaritan parable, in the essence that there was somebody in need in the ditch and two other people avoided him, but the Good Samaritan, an ethnic minority despised by the Israelites, helped that person, came to their aid. And I think that took risk. It was a dangerous road. There's a lot of background elements, but that person took risk, gave of themselves at personal cost. And I think, Cindy, at a certain level, we as educators need to be good Samaritans to our colleagues and just do the right thing. Is that too idealistic? And to come to the aid of someone who is vulnerable and hurting and is in that position where you can be of assistance and you choose not to, then we're part of the problem, even though we're avoiding it. What are your thoughts?
Well, as far as coming to the aid, I think that, yes, I would like to say that we should do more of that. Here's what I'm learning, and have learned for years and years and years and years, is that people don't know how to do that. A lot of times they're not speaking up because they don't know how, or they're a little fearful that they might say or do the wrong thing. And so when you talked about Martha Griffin, who, by the way, she and I have co-authored a paper, she and I both believe greatly in the power of cognitive rehearsal. And so that is a way for us to help our students and ourselves be able to speak up, to rehearse those uncivil encounters before they happen. So, now Martha and I we deviate a little bit. Martha loves to have scripts. I like to use evidence-based frameworks to create our own script, because the way you're going to address it, Keith, is different than me. That's different than some of our listeners. But either way, both are fine. This is just my preference. But when we go into a situation, let's say that a colleague comes to me to either complain or trash another colleague, all right?
Yep.
So Pam comes to me to trash Adam, all right? Now I have a choice. And by the way, we didn't define civility, but I can tell you that civility, in my mind, based on the concept analysis that we're doing, and something I've known for a long time, is that it's making a choice. We choose with every single encounter, with every single interaction, we have a choice about what we're going to do. So back to Pam and Adam, all right? So Pam comes and she begins to disparage Adam. I have a choice. My choice that I made a long time ago, I'm not going to play that game, not going to do it. So I might say something like this, Pam, that's not my experience with Adam. I wonder if that was taken out of context, and I really suggest you go chat with him about that, because it sounds like it's really troubling you. So that doesn't roll off the tongue, right? That takes practice, and that's why I love cognitive rehearsal. Let's do it again. Working with my students, let's do it again. Let's do it again. Do it again. And coaching, and then debriefing those sessions, and creating a safe container for us to have the dialogue about, hey, how did that go? What did you see? I just like to begin the debrief to ask students, what did you just see? So I think there are strategies, and we can be using them more.
And so let's then talk about civility, Cindy. That's worth defining. We haven't defined it yet, because that's what I really value about your work, is that the name of the book is called Creating and Sustaining Civility in Nursing. You're not talking about the problem, but you're really talking about the solution. And
Yeah.
by addressing and focusing on the solution, which is civility, it's kind of like, I see it like light and darkness, Cindy. When you shine the light of civility, the darkness is gone. It flees. It has no power. So let's talk about the light of civility and how we can, what it is, and then basically how can we strengthen and develop civility in both our students and within our interactions as faculty, so we can be a role model that is going to influence how our students are in practice. Because something tells me, Cindy, that, and maybe you have a different opinion, but as a nurse educator and a practicing nurse, I see incivility in both places. But I had no idea when I went into my first position how toxic academic environment was. And then I began to think, is there a connection between the incivility that I experienced between faculty and that trickling down effect, and then to what our students become in practice? I don't know. I don't know if you've done body of work, of any research to support that hypothesis, but I would love to get your insights on that.
Boy, you've said a lot of things there. So first of all,
let's start with civility. That's more important. I want to start with civility and encouraging that in our academic settings, because our students, I think what I hear from the Facebook group and when I read posts and I look at some of the stuff going on, it just grieves my heart. It sounds like we are raising it sounds like there's a bunch of monsters in our programs. It's like our students are turning into tyrants. And it's like, I think it's bad, but it seems like that the pandemic, the virtual settings, the stress, there's something going on, Cindy, in this last year that I think we're struggling with incivility and the stress and just the dynamics. And it's like, we've got to be doing some things differently. And I would just love to get your insights as you define civility. How can we begin as educators to demonstrate and to create that culture of civility?
Well, I'll go back to the first part when you mentioned the title of the book. And for those of you in the audience who have written books, you know that the publisher is the final say on what the title is of your book. Unless you're self-publishing, then it's all you, right? But so when I started writing, I said, I can't write this book if it's going to be given a title that I can't live with, which is the focus on all the bad stuff instead of what it is we're trying to gain. And I know there are a lot of really good books out there that have titles like that, but I was convinced that to be true to myself, I needed to make sure that it was about the end game of civility. Yes, we have to look under the hood. Yes, we have to identify the warts and wrinkles. Yes, we have to identify areas for improvement and growth. But ultimately, what we're trying to achieve here is a culture of civility in workplaces where we feel joyful and want to go to, whether they're virtual, hybrid, remote, online, or on campus, it doesn't matter. Yeah. So one of the things that I'm currently involved with when we get to this question that you have about what is civility. So back in 2008, maybe some of you have read my paper, a colleague and I published the first and only concept analysis on civility. That was interesting because initially I was invited to write a concept analysis on incivility. And I said to the editor, I'll write it, but I won't write it on incivility. I've got to write it on civility because that's what I believe. Well, anyway, we published that in 2008. Currently, in 2021, we're about to submit for publication what we're calling the concept of civility revisited. We went in, my research team and I, we've been immersed in doing this concept analysis. This is is not an issue just for us in the United States of America. This is an issue that, and we're talking educators. I know that we could be talking about the political arena, or we could be talking about the public square. But even when we just look at this in education or in nursing, this is an international phenomenon that we have all collectively got to grapple with. What we discovered, first of all, the body of work on this topic has exploded since '08 when we first wrote the first concept analysis. But here's what we're learning, that civility is a choice. We make a choice to engage or not to engage. And that being what we call merely civil doesn't cut it. So if I see someone being affronted and I sit silently by and do nothing, I'm sort of being merely civil. You know, I'm not getting into the fray, but I'm not really doing the true work of civility, which is to engage and to find ways to connect, to foster equity and belonging, and to help people come together, to create work and learning environments where everyone feels valued. That has nothing to do, by the way, with liking. So you and I, Keith, might work together and we like each other. That's a total bonus. But it has absolutely nothing to do with treating one another with respect and dignity. And that's what civility is. So when we think about putting it in the context of higher ed, are we collaborating with one another? Are we collegial? Are we pitching in? Are we doing our part? Are we stepping up? Are we serving? Are we being supportive? Are we managing conflict in a constructive way with our students? Are we creating learning spaces where they can feel successful? Are we implementing a student-centered philosophy? Are we, and tomorrow I'm doing a workshop with a group of university faculty talking about trauma-informed teaching and learning. Are we becoming aware as educators about what that means so that we can understand our learners and they can understand us? So all of that, you know, to say it's a lot to take in, but we have strategies. I noticed someone in the chat said, what do we do with students who are sort of unruly? Or, you know, number one, and those of you who know my work are probably sick of hearing me say it, but it's absolutely a fact that we put a team charter together, a class charter. We co-create our class expectations. We have a conversation about it. We hold one another accountable to those, including me as their professor. We reward the behavior that we see. We track it. In the undergraduate world, we might even give a few points. What I used to do as a professor, after we co-created norms, I said, okay, guys, go look in your we used Blackboard. I said, go look in your Blackboard site, and you'll notice that you just, by virtue of participating in this experience, have earned 10% of your grade as full points. And you will keep them because I believe you're going to fulfill the contract that we just made with one another. So it's a different perspective than saying you shall, or I'm your teacher and this is the way it's going to be. It's co-creating with our learners what that contract or set of expectations and class charter will be. It works. I know it works because I did it for years and years. Is it the be-all, end-all? No. But it's going to get you way ahead by doing that one strategy.
And, you know, that's really professional identity formation. You know, not, you know, Nelda Godfrey's work, and what I know you're working with Nelda on in that body of work as well. But that's really helping develop and name the values, Cindy, that nursing is prefaced upon, and that valuing, respecting, and making it practical and tangible. Correct?
Yeah, I don't know if we're out of time, but I do want to say Dr. Godfrey's work is just exquisite. And clearly intersects with this whole topic that we're having today.
Yeah.
You know, who are we and who do we want to be?
And, you know, I'd like to we've got a lot of questions, Cindy. I want to let's just kind of shift gears here. And I think these questions are going to help us just kind of maybe just put some closure and maybe bring some solutions, kind of like what are some things that we can do, as well as the things you've already shared, to kind of bring the needed change. But Jason had a great question. I don't think we addressed it. How do you see increasing diversity? I'll pop it on the screen for you, Cindy. How do you see increasing diversity in nursing and nursing education will impact incivility in the profession, looking at ethnic and even gender diversity? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a golden opportunity for us to hone our skills around how we are accepting of all of the members of the campus community. It's interesting because I communicate a lot with folks who are, quote, in the diversity, inclusion, and equity space. And here's my belief. I don't believe that we're going to do the best job we can if we aren't adding civility and respect into the mix. Because we can bring people in, but how do we have conversations, especially in our classrooms when maybe there are microaggressions that need to be addressed? How are we going to do that? That's now the role of the educator. I think we also need a lot of faculty development around this so that we understand how to have those conversations. I'm very worried, by the way, that civility may become a way of silencing us instead of bringing us together, and we must be cautioned against that. So when we say to a group of our students, let's be civil or some form or fashion, that means we're shutting down voices and we are silencing opinions that probably need to be and should be heard. So that's why I love the co-creation of the expectations. So you have, and I'm like all of you, I had a very diverse group of students, diverse of thought, diverse of background, diverse of religion, you name it. And it's a beautiful thing when we can crystallize that and say, you know what, every one of us, including me, your professor, comes from a different place, and my journey is different than yours. We all have, now here we are in this learning space. How do we want to take our game to the next level? How do we, and very often when I'm setting norms and co-creating them with my students, I would use some variation of this, asking students, how many of you in here, by a show of hands, aspire to be mediocre, marginal, so-so, not so great nurses? Raise your hand. And of course, they didn't, which is a good thing. And I'm talking, and then how many of us in here aspire to be competent, expert, ethical, awesome nurses? Raise your hand. Well, my hand goes up, hand goes up. And now I say, now that we can agree that that's our overarching aspiration, how are we going to get there? What are the behaviors that we want to see in this classroom that will get us to our goal? And that, but there's a lot of different ways that probably our listeners are doing it. The point is, we have to show respect for everybody's pathway and journey.
No, and so true, Cindy. That's well said. And I've got another question I'd like to throw out there. This is from Kate. Can you give suggestions on handling student incivility towards the professor? Now, maybe some of the principles of cognitive rehearsal, but in general, if you just look at some of the comments, the biting, sometimes those direct interactions, when you're kind of caught off guard, you're almost flabbergasted and you don't have a response, but you have one the next day. But I'm just curious, just what are your thoughts on that in principle? Just kind of, it's a very broad question, but yet in general, how would you address that? Just some thoughts.
Well, I come back to that idea of having that conversation with them. What are the expectations? So very often students, when we're co-creating norms, will say, I think we need to address people in a respectful manner. So let's say that's one of our norms, just for the heck of it, as it relates to this question. Now I have a student who is, says something really offensive. I might say something like, I know that you were part of us when we all agreed that we were going to treat one another with respect, and I'm not feeling as though we're having that kind of interaction right now. So can you tell me a little bit more about what your issue is in a more professional manner? And always going back to that's why I love Nelda's work. To be a professional nurse, what does that mean? And I think too often we fail with our students to spend time on things like going over the Code of Ethics, which clearly states, provision 1.5, that every nurse has an ethical and moral obligation to create, let's see if I can remember it, cultures of civility and kindness. I'll never forget it, so I'm teasing you. Yeah. I know exactly what the Code of Ethics says. So spending time with our students on those kinds of things before it gets to, incivility can go a long way. Now, especially with the pandemic and everything else that's going on, people are uber stressed. And so sometimes people, because they're stressed, which really isn't an excuse, but when we are stressed, we are more likely to behave badly. So I might try to ask that student, could you say that a different way? I know you're under a lot of pressure right now. Or maybe you delay that conversation. Say, you know what? There's a lot of emotion right now, and I'm happy to meet with you once we both get in a little bit better headspace. So there's all kinds of different ways, but they don't always roll off the tongue. They take practice.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And, we're going to have to wrap this up, Cindy, but I do want to do a couple of things. I do want to have one final question for you that I'm going to ask you, but I also wanted to let you know that you also are available. You know what? You have an email address, do you not? And you don't mind if educators email you, and you would, it's kind of like, who would you like to, who do you want to kind of, what kind of, if an educator who's struggling with either student or faculty incivility, is there any kind of, how would you kind of just, would you like them, how could they reach out to you, and what would you like them, are you comfortable doing that? I mean, I know you gave me the email address, but what would you like to hear from regarding educators? How could you best serve their needs and their struggles that they may be facing in this area?
Well, of course, I'm available to people, and I think you put up my Civility Matters website earlier too. And
yep, it's in the link in the chat, so they can just click it and go. Yeah. So, yes, it's a little long, so it's hard to put into a message, and they're going to forget it. But the link is there, and it will live on.
I'm an academic, and it's on an academic server, so.
Yes, I know, it's all good. But yeah, so you know what, if you have questions out there that didn't get answered, Cindy's available. She's got the email address. But in closing, Cindy, we've answered a lot of questions. We've covered a lot of ground. But I would just like to close with this thought. There are educators like myself that may have said, I'm done. Never again. This is too painful. And they have something to offer. There's a reason they're in nursing education. And it's like, to those that are just on fumes, they're stressed out themselves. Because one thing that I learned in nursing education, students are stressed, faculty are stressed. Put that together, that's a toxic stew for incivility. It's all too easy. And so for those that are struggling, Cindy, what are some pearls, one or two principles that you would just share to encourage those that are kind of brokenhearted, who are kind of, I thought my students would like me at some level. I have something up, and they find they're not liked, and they're just, students can be very mean and very, boy, it can be unexpected. And it's like you just kind of are disillusioned. I know I was at times. So for those that are in that place, Cindy, what would be something to just kind of maybe just to give them a different perspective or an encouragement? I'd just love to get your thoughts and a closing pearl or two.
Well, I have to say this, that I think one of the most important things we can all do, every single person, is to put a plan in place, if you haven't already, to take care of yourself. As a behavioral health nurse, this topic is near and dear to me because we know, you know, I know that nurses and other healthcare professionals are dealing with increased suicide rates, burnout, moral distress, moral injury, substance abuse, you name it. And so we have got to take time and take care of ourselves. One of the most important lessons that was learned way back 100 years ago in the 1918 pandemic, if you go and you sort of deconstruct that a little bit, that there was a vital need for collaboration and relationship building. And the same is ever more true today. So for us to build relationships, to share our stories, to make meaningful connections, to not be shut down because we feel ashamed or we're less than or whatever, and to reach out and to celebrate your accomplishments and the accomplishments of your teammates. And I would also say a dose of empathy helps. And so to think about, before any encounter that you're having with your colleague or your student or really anybody, you know, and maybe this is because I'm a cognitive therapist, but what might life be like for that other person? You know, just do a little bit of cognitive work. What might their journey be? What might their experiences be? What could they be going through? Because it changes us. It changes that mindset to act with empathy and goodwill. And I would say this in closing. Guess what? We get to choose who we want to be. We get to choose who we want to be. So we get to consider our role and our place in this world, whatever it may be, whatever legacy we wish to leave. We need to think about that, because whatever legacy we leave, it will be indelible. So ask yourself this: how do I want to be remembered during this pandemic and after? How do I want others to look back and define my role and my contributions? Because how we act today really reveals our character and our grit. And we need you. I guess that would be, we need you as nurse educators. So I believe that the need for fostering civility in healthy work environments has never been greater. So I want to close by saying thank you, thank you, thank you for the contributions all of you are making every single day. And I just think you're amazing, and the work is tough, and you're doing it, and you're hanging in there. And just please take care of yourselves.
You know what? You said it great, Cindy. I have nothing more to share, except I'll be back in 2 weeks with a guest talking about escape rooms and how we can strengthen some of the active learning. So join me in 2 weeks. And I want to thank Dr. Cynthia Clark. You've been, this has gone way too quickly, and I only got through half my questions. Maybe, you know, and you we'll connect at other times, Cindy, and we'll continue this another day. But you've done a wonderful, thank you again for your body of work and just really the difference you've made. And I think so many educators that you have no idea how you've impacted, as well as my own. So I just want to say thank you.
Thank you. You all have a wonderful evening.
All right. Good night, guys. Have a good night.
Good night.
Good night.